Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today on how to inflation-proof your vehicle program. My name is Maggie Woods, and I am the onboarding specialist here at Modus, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. We will have a question and answer period at the end of this discussion. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A chat, and we will address those either throughout the presentation or at the end. During the presentation today, we're going to be doing 3 different polls, and we're using those polls to gain a little insight into the current state of affairs. So please make sure that you participate, because you could qualify to win one of 3 $100 Visa gift cards. So before I introduce our panel, let's go ahead and do that very first poll. So let's see where everyone is with their current program. All right, so the question is, when was the last time you adjusted your allowance for reimbursement that you provide your employees? We'll give everybody a minute or two to log their answers in. I love the variety in the answers, so that's great. Looks like those answers are starting to slow down a little bit. And a number of you seem to have said, it's been so long, I can't remember. So we're going to make sure that we address why it's important for companies to continually reevaluate their vehicle program, especially during inflation. So let's go ahead and kick things off. I would like to introduce our expert panelists for this afternoon. Todd Gebsky joined the Modus team in 2011 and has had more than 20 years of experience leading high-growth software as a service and subscription-based businesses. As Modus's Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer, Todd is charged with driving the company's corporate strategy, brand, and market execution. Also joining us is Katie Lang. Katie joined Runsimer in 2010 and has more than 11 years in helping companies develop reimbursement models that help them manage their programs. In 2018, Katie transitioned to the Modus team after the merger of the 2 companies and is currently in a senior regional sales executive role. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with today's conversation. And before I bring in that expert panel, I want to throw in our second poll. So let's see that poll. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most severe, how much is inflation affecting your vehicle program and its cost structure? All right. Starting to get a couple of answers. It's exciting. Okay. So it looks like most of you are seeing some definite impact from inflation. And so Todd, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand this discussion over to you.
Great. Thanks, Maggie. And thank you all for joining today. As Maggie mentioned, my name is Todd Gebsky. I'm Chief Strategy and Marketing Officer at Modus. In a short while, I'll introduce my colleague, Katie Lang. She's, as Maggie just mentioned, spent more than 10 years advising companies like yours on the development and practical execution of competitive and non-taxable vehicle programs. Katie's humble, but she's an expert. I'm proud to be presenting alongside of her today. And before I hand the mic over to Katie, I want to spend a few minutes orienting all of us to the complex market dynamics that we're operating within, and how so many of the challenges we're facing are directly related and frankly nearly impossible to have avoided. I think it's fair to say that we're all feeling the weight of inflation. As a husband and a father of 3 rapidly growing children, I'm far more in tune with the realities of inflation today than in past periods of my life. When I was younger, before I was a homeowner, before I was raising a family. But from groceries to fuel to home improvements, we're all paying more for almost everything. And oftentimes, today we're getting less in return. And this, is especially true for our employees who drive for work. Gas prices are subject to rapid volatility. And as we'll discuss further, vehicle costs and residual values are in a sustained period of elevation on the heels of a 2-year global pandemic, historic inflation rates, the Great Resignation, and recent global conflict taking front stage. We're not only challenged with preservation at home, but in our places of employment. And protecting our bottom lines, retaining top talent will help each of us, help our corporate institutions and the broader US economy weather the uncertain market conditions that we're operating within. Many of you who are joining today, are responsible for employee mobility within your organizations. And for those of you, I think the timing of our discussion today couldn't be more relevant. If your vehicle program is not being adjusted to keep pace with increasing inflation, your drivers are likely having to subsidize your business expenses out of their own pockets. And for those employees who may not be willing to do so, they may be deciding to drive less, and in some cases not at all, which certainly is not the behavior that you desire. Let's go to the next slide, please. I think, as you saw in the previous slide, we're sort of at a historic inflation rate just this morning, and this shows that this is moving quickly. The Bureau of Labor Statistics announced that what yesterday coming out of January data was a 7.5% inflation rate, has now jumped as of this morning to 7.9%. But both of those represent the greatest annual inflation rate we've seen since 1982. And the two largest contributors to this historic inflation rate are homes and motor vehicles, which makes sense. Those are generally two of the bigger ticket items we all spend on. As it relates to vehicle programs specifically, inflation has impacted nearly all costs related to owning and operating a vehicle. Keeping in mind 7.9% inflation, while it's historic, it's an average, and it's an average of a broad array of consumer goods and services. So, the chart that we've got up right here, I've taken the liberty of highlighting several vehicle-related categories. Sadly, they're all upper right. And I just want everyone to note that each one of these three categories, themselves have seen a 20% or higher rate of inflation just last year alone. So, for the rest of my time with you, I want to sort of use this as a jump off point to really drill in on each of the cost components that we all need to be considering relative to our vehicle programs, and just give you a better sense of what's happening within each. So if we could go to the next slide, please. All right, so beginning with automobiles themselves, since January of 2021, we've seen an increase in used car prices here in the United States of greater than 45%. Vehicles that are more than 7 years old have seen the biggest percentage price increase, and one of over 30%. In fact, the vehicle models off to the right on this chart, is really an illustration of, some vehicles that are used are actually selling more than their owners paid for them when the vehicles were brand new. The examples here, Hyundai Accent, is selling for 11% more than when it was new. Ford Bronco Sport, 16.4% more than its average price new. Toyota Tacoma, 12.2%. And, we don't all have a lot of employees driving G-Class Mercedes. the G-Class Mercedes is selling for, $62,000 more than its original price. So, representing a 36% increase. It's not just used cars. So new car prices have also increased, 12.2% over the past year. And I think it's interesting that the average new car price in the U.S. today has, surpassed $45,000, which is impactful because it's putting new cars out of reach for many consumers here in this country. That's all really interesting. I think it's equally interesting, to really drill deeper and understand why. Much of the inflationary pressure that we're experiencing can be traced to supply chain shortages that really were induced by COVID-19. For automobiles, that means sort of supply chain relative to computer chips. Shortages in these chips led to over 11 million vehicles being trimmed from production in 2021. And the short supply of these chips is causing auto manufacturers to use parts that they can obtain and use them on their most profitable models. Okay, so using them on their most profitable models is really reducing the supply chain. And when you reduce the supply chain, it has the inverse effect on prices in the form of increases. Historically, the used vehicle market has been, refreshed with a steady supply of vehicles turned in by owners whose leases are expiring. We're seeing a shift there too. Today, more owners are holding on to their leased cars because they can't afford the price of upgrading to a new one, or in the examples above, sometimes the used ones are even more expensive. So we'll move on now from automobiles themselves to what we're all, I think, keenly astute to, what we're seeing sort of when we fill up our gas tanks. The average price of a gallon of gas just this past Sunday moved above $4 in this country. And that's, an average increase of 57 cents more than it was just a month ago. The all-time high that we've seen was back in July 2008, when the average price hit $4.11 per gallon. Interestingly, if you kind of look at the price in 2008 and you were to adjust that $4.11, for inflation, be looking at, a price per gallon, equal to $5.25 today. We've come out of the pandemic. We're all starting to drive around more, and therefore the demand for oil and gas has risen a lot faster than the supply has. The industry had to shut down to adjust to much lower consumption while we were all sheltering at home and not commuting into cities for our jobs. And frankly, the industry hasn't quite caught up yet. Next slide, please. As it relates to, auto insurance rates, this is an area that folks might not, we don't look at our premium costs all that frequently. And it's not one of those that jumps off the page to a lot of folks as, being directly related to supply chain or, the increase in a barrel of, petroleum. But, the overall cost of doing business, is increasing for all companies in the United States, and insurance companies are not, isolated from those increased costs. Because that cost of doing business, is part of the calculation of premiums, we can all expect to be, paying higher premiums in 2022. Bureau of Labor Statistics, says that prices for motor vehicle insurance are, 5 to 6% higher in the last 2 years. Early on in the onset of COVID, there was an initial decline in the number of miles people were driving. I think that's obvious. But that quickly changed over the past 6 months as we've continued to emerge from staying at home, and we're all now driving more. And, in fact, our data and data from, other experts like AAA, shows that driving's really returned to near pre-pandemic levels. So I think it's obvious, but as more folks are back on the road, we've also seen a rise in accident frequency and severity, which means more claims. And, the supply challenges that we discussed a few moments ago, combined with higher demand for cars themselves and parts, have really served to accelerate the cost of insurance premiums as well. Go to the next slide, please. If you've had the pleasure or displeasure of taking your vehicle in for repairs lately, you've undoubtedly noticed that the cost of maintenance isn't what it used to be. What used to cost a couple $100 now can run double or even triple that amount. And there are really several factors at play here. The first is the rise in labor rates. The automotive industry is currently, at a really severe shortage of qualified service technicians. It's estimated that just to keep up with demand, the industry will need to add, more than 46,000 more technicians by 2026. And because of this shortage, dealerships or repair facilities are required to pay more to recruit and to retain their service technicians, much like all of us are faced with in our businesses. And, that increase in recruiting and retention is at least partially subsidized by the consumer who's bringing their vehicle in to be maintained or repaired. Another factor is the steady rise in the price of replacement parts, right? Tires, just as one example, are becoming increasingly expensive, right? They're becoming more expensive because, the prices of raw materials like rubber, steel, and oil are increasing, and therefore the cost to manufacture tires is also increasing. And, not unlike the situation with labor costs, the increased cost of production, you guessed it, is passed on to us as consumers as well. If you go to the last slide, please. I think it's also important, just, not only because it's timely, but, all of these things is so directly, related. I think we've talked about how supply chain issues and, computer chip shortages have driven car prices to new records, for much of the past year. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine could and is starting to make the situation even worse. I've talked about how new and used car prices are already outpacing the general rate of inflation before this conflict. But it's, I think, important for all of us to coalesce around the impact that things like sanctions and the world's response to the conflict, how they might, impact or relate to just the U.S. economy and the U.S. auto market, as we're discussing today. First and foremost, Ukraine and Russia are both sources of a lot of raw materials that are used to manufacture cars. Ukraine supplies 70% of the world's neon gas. Well, why is that important? That's what's used to power lasers that are needed to make semiconductor chips, which we've talked about there's a massive shortage of. It's also home to two factories that make wiring systems for vehicles. So, this conflict has forced those factories to close, and closing the factories has ripple effects for the automakers that rely on these wiring parts that they produce. And so, a couple of examples, both Volkswagen and BMW have shut down, German factories because they can't, source the wiring harnesses for the vehicles they're manufacturing. Russia supplies 40% of the world's palladium that precious metal palladium is actually used in not only semiconductor chips, but also the catalytic converters that allow all of our vehicles to meet the emissions regulations we have in this country. And it also supplies 11% of the world's nickel, which is heavily used in electric vehicle batteries. So, all of these factors, have and will likely continue to cause, unfavorable increases in vehicle-related costs. As it relates to the raw materials, just earlier this week, prices for aluminum and palladium hit record highs, and prices for nickel reached a high, that we hadn't seen since 2007. So, I'm actually tiring myself out from, being the bearer of doom and gloom here. My intent in, sharing this data certainly was not to depress anyone. Instead, my hope is that, it served as a brief education on both cause and effect, and that, you leave today with a, more of an appreciation for the interconnected sum of the parts and how they're directly impacting your organization and your employees. I think it's time now that we shift to the more positive and constructive. I'm very pleased to introduce Katie Lang. Katie will discuss some what I hope will be very relevant approaches to ensuring that your vehicle program keeps pace with the increasing costs that we discussed and all of the market uncertainties that we're all facing. So Katie, I'll turn it to you.
Great. Thanks, Todd. I appreciate it. I was just going to tell you to go to the next slide. And just as a reminder, if you guys do have questions throughout our conversation, please don't hesitate to put that into the chat. I'm happy to answer them as we move along. Just wanted to get started. When we look at what are the options for companies, there's really 4 options depending on what makes the most sense for your business. Really today's focus is more on the reimbursement side and how inflation affects those programs. So wanted to start off talking a little bit about some of the challenges we see within car allowances specifically, and then we'll dive into how we can create a tax-free, more fair and accurate reimbursement model that's going to account for some of these increases in prices that employees are incurring.
Katie, there was a question from the chat.
Okay.
So how does this program comply with labor code laws?
Yep, that's a great question. And actually, I'm going to get to the labor code law piece here in just a minute. So if you could just hold tight, we're actually going to talk about labor code laws on the next one. First, wanted to touch though on the taxability piece because that's really the big one, right? So anytime you provide a car allowance, it's taxable to the company as well as to the employee. So in this example, if you were providing a $600 car allowance today to employees, the company has to pay tax on that, right? So you're actually spending about $645, and the employee is also taking a really big hit from a tax perspective. So on a $600 car allowance, they're only netting a little over $419. So every single year, that equates to a little over $2,700 that's going straight to the IRS in just tax waste. So when you look at that and you look at your overall program, it can be pretty astonishing, right? So just in this example on 85 employees, that's going to equate to over $230,000 every single year. So when we talk about how we can create a better benefit from an employee standpoint as well as to the company, because we can make it tax-free, you can actually provide more dollars to the employee and spend less from a company standpoint. So for example, you could say, hey, on average, we want everybody to net, $650, $700. You spend $700, they would net $700.
Okay. A question has come into the chat and they're asking how you calculate the tax.
Yep, no, great question. So what we're looking at is from a company perspective, you have to pay FICA, so that's 7.65%. And then on the company side or the employee side, they're also being taxed. So they have the FICA, and then they have state and federal income tax as well. Because it's a car allowance, it's treated like income.
Okay,
Good question.
great.
All right, next slide. All right, so this is the labor code laws. And so the great question. So when we look at car allowance programs, one of the other challenges is there's certain states that have specific labor code laws. Essentially what that says is that employees need to be reimbursed for any expense that they incur for doing business. And if you provide just a kind of a flat car allowance, right, there's no substantiation behind that number. So an employee could say, hey, this is not enough to cover my costs in order to drive my car for business purposes. And there have been numerous cases where companies have been sued and resulted in a lot of kind of penalties and back pay just because they were not compliant with those labor code laws. You can't prove that you actually gave them enough for what they needed.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. So when we talk about how our program can actually be compliant, it's because we have the data to substantiate the amount that you're giving. So instead of moving from just one flat rate for everybody and treating everybody the same, you now have data behind the amount that you're actually giving them. You can go to the next slide. Okay. The other challenge is, anytime you treat employees the same and you're giving a car allowance, it's not fair, right? And what I mean by that is, depending on where you live, how much you drive, your costs to own and operate that vehicle are very different. So if you're somebody who's putting a lot more miles on your vehicle versus a lower mileage driver, you're getting the same amount, but you're incurring a lot more wear and tear on your vehicle. And then we take a look at some of the other expense. Gas specifically is really on top of mind for everybody. If you're somebody in California, and I believe it's hard to believe, but LA, I think, was at $7 a gallon. I'm located in the Milwaukee area, it just went up to $4, but there's a really big difference. So companies really need to make sure that they are looking at that piece because you do not want to disincentivize any employees that really should be driving and visiting accounts as part of their job. Insurance is another one that a lot of companies, may not think of and not top of mind. But again, depending on where you live, for example, Michigan pays 4 times the amount for insurance than somebody in North Carolina. So again, making sure that you understand that geography plays a really big role because those costs are very, very different. Any question, or we can move on? All right.
No questions on that one yet.
Okay, perfect. All right, so how does it work? So when we talk about a fixed and variable reimbursement program, and we call it FAVOR for short, there's 2 components that are going to go into it. So if you think about the fixed costs for an employee, that's really what it costs to own the vehicle. So whether or not it leaves the garage, they have insurance, taxes, license, registration, and depreciation. So an employee would get a fixed rate every single month. And then their variable costs are really their operating cost. So that's really what it costs, when they're out on the road and driving and visiting clients and doing their job. So that's going to include fuel, maintenance, and tires. So for every business mile that they drive, they will get a variable reimbursement. Now, both the fixed and the variable are going to be based on that geographical location, how much they drive, and then what we call a standard-based vehicle. Essentially, from a company standpoint, you'll base it off of a vehicle you think is fair for them to do their job, and then we'll calculate it based off of that. Now, both the fixed and the variable are going to be 100% tax-free, so tax-free to the company as well as to the employee.
So Katie, we do have a question, and you may have touched on this, so I just want to make sure that we've answered the question appropriately. But what are the IRS requirements for this to be tax-free?
Yep, no, so great question. So you're right, because it's the IRS, right? They want substantiation. And so we have all of the data to actually show that this is true expense reimbursement. They have a couple of rules around that piece as well. One of those is that they have to be a true business driver, and they have to drive a minimum of 5,000 business miles per year, as well as we have to verify that they have insurance and that it's at the right level, because that is included within the reimbursement on the fixed side. And then the other piece is vehicle age. Again, you as a company can decide on what you would want to set that as. And then the MRSP, because that's also built into the fixed portion. So those are the components that go in from an IRS perspective. I always like to frame it that, an easy way to think about how can this be tax-free as opposed to a typical car allowance. If you think about a car allowance, right, there's no reasoning behind it. It's just a random number. So that's why it has to be treated as income. In this program, because we have the data, the IRS views it as that true business expense. So no different if, they had to stay at a hotel for business and so forth.
Great. We had another question come in, and it asks about how the maintenance and tire portion of the vehicle amount is calculated. And the other question that goes hand in hand with that is that automatically changed by Modus to account for inflation?
Yep, great question. So you're absolutely right. So on the variable piece, that is actually going to be updated every single month. So we are going to be taking into account the different fluctuations within pricing. And then the maintenance and tires are going to be based on the level of vehicle that you choose, as well as the anticipated business mileage that they're driving.
All right, great. That's all the questions we have so far. So I think we can go ahead and move on.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, kind of tie back in. Todd was walking through some of those different inflation pieces. So hopefully this gets you thinking a little bit, differently about some of the different costs that really go into it and making sure that, it is going to be accurate. So it's not only the insurance piece, you have to think about all those other pieces that go into it. Fuel, again, is really top of mind. So whether or not you are doing something today to account for fuel, making sure that the employee is not having to incur extra expense is really, really important.
Okay. Great. Well, we're about to enter the Q&A section of this presentation. And before we do that, I want to discuss, or I want to pose our final poll question. So remember, participate for a chance to win one of those $100 Visa gift cards. All right, so here's our question. What would you rather do with your vehicle program? Do you want to pay more for your car allowance to compensate for inflation, do nothing, or make the switch? Okay. Looks like lots of folks are looking for a tax-free solution, and that's great. So we're going to dive right into to the questions that we have. So forgive me as I look to multiple screens to figure out those questions. So we have a question, and I'm not sure who will answer this. So this is to both of you. When is the right time to roll out a program like this?
And I can speak to that, Todd.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a simple answer, right? Anytime is a good time to be able to switch to this type of model. So what we would do is really better understand what your objectives and goals are. But really, especially if you're coming from a taxable car allowance, the sooner you can start recouping that tax waste and still create a better benefit to the employee, there's really no reason to wait. So it's just understanding that piece of it.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Katie. All right, our next question is, our employees talk to each other. So how do you handle employees who are getting different amounts, and how do we explain those reimbursement amounts?
Yep, I think that's a great question. Yeah, and it really all comes down to communication, right? And that's a piece where we'll help talk to that as well. But it really is a simple conversation, right? So if you ask most people, right, they understand the fact that, hey, this person that's living in California, they are incurring a lot more expense than I am in Milwaukee, right? So it is actually a more simple conversation than most people would anticipate.
Yeah, and I think it's one, this is an oversimplified answer, but it is one that, I have found effective when you equate vehicle related reimbursement to any other reimbursable or, T&E category, you pose the question back to an employee like, hey, should, when you submit a receipt, for the steak dinner you took a client to, do we just give you $500? Or do we pay you down to the penny what the receipt showed, because you were able to substantiate what you actually, entertained? And, I don't think it's much different. Cars, unfortunately, this is as close to, a car spitting out a receipt as you're going to get, just in terms of the accuracy and, sort of the breakdown in, real-time cost components, that make up the fixed and the variable components of your rates. But, I think Katie's point is really good, which is, I think the flat approaches, whether it's allowance or whether it's 1 cent per mile rate, they're not accurate, and they create sort of a paradigm of winners and losers, within your employee base. And so I think just, orienting folks to no other category do we pay you an arbitrary amount or reimburse you an arbitrary amount. And further, you may today be on the winning side, and we are now trying to make this more equitable for retention and recruiting, and just overall, do what's right for your most valuable sort of resources in human capital.
Those are both great answers. So thank you very much for that insight. Our final question that we've received is, can the employee still drive the car that they want?
Yes, so they would still have freedom of choice to drive the vehicle that they want, as long as it's within your policy. So just because, for example, you base it, if you base your program on, as if they're driving, a full-size sedan, right? If they still want to drive the F-250, they can do that. If they prefer to drive something that's more economical, they can do that as well.
Great. Perfect. Well, we are at the end of our question and answer period, and we did get another question, and I'm sorry about that. So this question is, what's the maximum MSRP of the vehicle that is still allowed to be considered for this program and compliant with the IRS?
That's a really good question. So when it comes to the MRSP piece, it does depend on which vehicle you choose it on, because they did have different MRSPs. But essentially, from an IRS perspective, whichever one you choose, it has to be within 90% value of what the MRSP was. Not what you paid for, but what the MRSP was.
Okay. All right. Any other questions in the popping up in the chat here? I don't see any. So I'd like to end this conversation with our information, and I would encourage you that if you have additional questions, or if you'd like more information on how a tax-free allowance model can impact your program, or you're interested in a financial analysis, please reach out to us at marketing@modus.com. Again, that's marketing@modus.com. And on behalf of Todd, Katie, and myself, I would like to thank you for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Todd and Katie for their wonderful insight into how inflation impacts vehicle programs.
Pleasure. Thank you all for joining. Please don't be bashful about reaching out. If there's any follow-up questions, we're more than happy to engage.
Absolutely. We look forward to it.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Yes.